Okay, now let's go to verse 19, or we'll never get through chapter 2. I'll start in 17. It shall come to pass in the last days, says God, I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your young men shall see visions. Your old men shall dream dreams. And on my men servants and on my maid servants I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they shall prophesy. And a lot of that could be said is the day of Pentecost. But now look what happens in verse 19. And I will show wonders in heaven above, and signs in the earth beneath, and blood and fire and vapor and smoke, and the sun will be turned to darkness, the moon to blood, before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. And it shall come to pass, one of the most beautiful salvation verses in the Bible, whoever calls in the name of the Lord will be saved. Peter is quoting from Joel. What I just read to you is Joel, describing the coming day of the Lord. Partially it was fulfilled on Pentecost, but hugely God has plans for the 144,000 Jewish evangelists. They're going to reach out to every single person on earth and share the gospel with them. And from this tribulation evangelism, the greatest number of countless converts are going to be gathered around the throne in heaven. Probably most of them will be martyred. When we see them in chapter 7 of Revelation, they're wearing white robes because they have been martyred. And they're under the throne saying, how long, O Lord, how long are you going to let this go on? Now, what's interesting is, why is this Pentecost? Well, God unusually uses the 7 Jewish feasts as a bit of a prophetic roadmap. Jesus became our Passover Lamb, paying for our life with his own on Passover. So Jesus was the fulfillment of Passover. During the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is launched in Passover and follows right after Passover, Jesus remained in the grave for those 3 days, putting away sin for us. That's why in baptism, we die with Christ, we're buried with Christ, and then we're risen with Christ. And so on the beginning of the third feast, there are 7. Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. Passover, unleavened breads, those 3 are just one continuous event, each different days. But on first fruits, Jesus rose bodily from the dead, becoming the evidence of God's ultimate provision, the promise of a last day's resurrection harvest. I mean, that's in the Jewish feast, that's what it was pointing at. The fourth festival is called Pentecost by Christians. It's in Leviticus. It's the 50th day after Pentecost. After Passover. And so it's just a countdown. Jesus is following this countdown. He did everything he could to be in Jerusalem and to be crucified just when the high priest was sacrificing the Passover lamb for the nation. And at 3 p.m, when the high priest brought up his knife in front of everybody and slit the throat of the Passover lamb, Jesus was hanging on the cross, and the great high priest was receiving his death on the cross. God the Father was receiving the death of his Son as a Passover lamb. So those 4 are really easy. They totally correspond. But what's interesting is the last 3. There are 3 more. According to the prophets, God will call for the blowing of the shofar to start the Feast of Trumpets. He himself will awaken Israel and regather them after he calls his church home in the rapture. Very interesting. Now, does it mean that it's got to be on the Feast of Trumpets or the Day of Atonement or whatever? No. But what's interesting is the first 4 were exactly. He will judge his people, give the remnant of Israel a spirit of repentance, and cover them with the blood of Messiah's atonement, which the temple's sacrifice anticipated. That's Yom Kippur. And that corresponds with the future event called the second coming of Christ. And that's how it's portrayed all the way through the Old Testament prophets, in sequence. And finally, then and only then will the feasting begin. Messiah will enter the temple, and according to Zechariah 14, 16, and 19, all the nations are going to come every year to Jerusalem to celebrate that feast, which they're celebrating all through the millennium. 28% of your Old Testament is all about that. It's all yet future.